son. Where'd you find this?
Hey guys, Virgil, AJ. Thank you so much for joining us today.
What up? What up?
What up? Yeah. So I figure we should start light. What have you guys been up to? What are you guys working on right now?
I'll let you go first.
Yeah. Either.
No, my usual tornado, right? You know, like me and the close cohorts of 2020 have just been counting the sort of like the weeks, basically, you know, of this like this gelling of this year, you know, like there hasn't been one dull week, there hasn't been one dull moment. And, you know, to stay sane, it's like the usual like list of projects, you know, in between fashion and art and just staying awake and staying alive and staying healthy.
I guess I'll jump in. Yeah, I just been, you know, it's like everybody, you know, nobody anticipated COVID. In the beginning, I was very much like, oh, this is great. I still have my work to do, but I don't have any deadlines anymore because so many things kind of got canceled. So like initially, you know, I was like, oh, this is the best of possible worlds. Now, of course, I don't know how far we're into it now. So, but I've been like busy too. Just like super, super busy. I guess the two primary things that I've been working on is I have a show at the Louisiana Museum in December. So pushing pretty hard to get the work done for that so that we can, I think we have to ship at the end of October. So, you know, I've got another maybe 4 weeks to go on that. And also started a film company, which I'm really excited about. Got it funded for 3 years. A bit of a laboratory in addition to just being a traditional production company, you know. So I'm really excited about that getting up and going, just because it's going to allow me to implement many of the things that I've been talking about for so long, particularly around the whole production of Black cinema and stuff. You know? So yeah, that's most of what I've been doing. So it's called Sun House, actually.
Sun House?
Sun House, yeah.
Crazy.
But spelled like Bauhaus, like Sunhaus.
I like that as the tagline already.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Well, no, I'm gonna just interject really quick because we got so much to catch up on anyways. That short thing that you showed me in Miami Basel last year on your phone.
What was it? I can't remember. I have all kinds of shit on my phone.
He had the Louis mid layer. It was like a couple scene. It was like a
yeah. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, that was a scene from this thing that it was a sketch for this thing that I was working on with a friend called Aversion. Yeah, that was the thing with Alice and yeah.
Is it coming out or no?
Honestly, probably not. I mean, you know, it's like so many things. It's like a sketch. I'm really interested in both of those actors. They're really Nathan and Alice, and so we were just trying to, you know, keep busy. We were experimenting with some things, and I was really interested in particular Nathan for the lead in a much bigger project that I had. So essentially, he came out, and we just workshopped for a couple of weeks, and then we shot that little sort of teaser, I guess.
Yeah, I remember it. It was fire, but I was like, exactly. It was one of those Basel meetings where you just link up and have like a real dinner conversation. Then you know you're never gonna see again.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's really different for me, like this particular moment, is in the past I used to make a lot of things, and I mean, for most of my life, I guess I would make things, and then I would kind of just put them in the closet because I wasn't ever really so much a film festival person, and there was no YouTube or anything like that. So the whole social media infrastructure wasn't in place. So it really wasn't a way to share things, really, you know. So I just have a backlog of stuff, you know. I'm just starting to dig through it now, like the things like, oh yeah, this is cool, or that was cool, you know. And you know, like when I shared it with you, it's like this whole idea that you're constantly exploring things. They don't always have to turn. I think most people sometimes feel like everything that you touch and you mess with has to turn into a product, so to speak. You know what I mean? As opposed to like you're just trying to like look and see what, if anything, the implications of a thing are. I had a tendency for years to just do things in my head. And my best friend, like Greg Tate, he used to always say, my Achilles heel was once I worked something out in my head, I get bored and lose interest in it, which was kind of true, I think, to a certain degree. But increasingly, you know, I'm very preoccupied with what happens when the thing is an actual artifact. I mean, how it activates space, people's imaginations in a different way, even though there's something to be said about sharing mood boards and things like that. Of course, I'm really excited about that. I thought it was very important that we started off with a DJ because I think increasingly, you know, what's going on in the process of being a DJ is so central to where we are in terms of like art and expression now, because as the world becomes like increasingly full of things, I mean, we're machines for making things now. Increasingly, there's something to be said that's radically ecologically sound about recycling things. You know, DJs, what's really magical about it is they take a set of finite moments or artifacts of expression, and just by resequencing them, they make a completely new thing without actually taking up any more space. You know, I mean, it's fundamental what Duchamp did when he took the urinal, which is he didn't make anything new. He didn't physically or materially make anything, but he created a thing without actually manipulating material. So it's one of the sort of fundamental conundrums or things that's super exciting about, I think, what creativity is gonna kind of have to look like now. So.
You know, what's funny, you know, I've been going back to this image of Kool Herc, like riding in his convertible with the two speakers as like the premier expression of like DJ, you know, and I've been like the mixer itself is like one of the greatest like Black inventions. You know, it might not technically be, but how we took that piece of equipment. Yeah. We were like extending breaks of songs so that people dance longer. Then boom, it's hip hop. But then it's like a modern mode of Black expression, all the way down to exactly what you were saying. And what's wild is like the last DJ set that I remember was in Venice at that club. Like, was it the day before you won the Golden Lion?
It was actually. Before I knew that the Golden Lion existed, because I didn't know until they called me. I was like, what is this you're calling me? But but you know that whole thing you were saying about like, you know, the whole idea of like we didn't make, you know, speaker systems, but I think we did. I think that's one of the things that's fundamentally interesting about, in particular, Black American expressivity, because so much of, and I've said this before, it's in the realm of what I would call immaterial invention, you know, and there's some obviously very concrete reasons for that, but so often we create things that we didn't invent or something like that, like basketball. Like we didn't invent basketball, but we certainly created it, you know, or taking Timbs and wearing them with the strings untied, two sides is too large and on backwards, whatever, you know what I mean? That's a way of inventing things that really doesn't involve actually transfiguring or manipulating material. You know, it's like, it's something that I've been like obsessed with for a long time. And so I think obviously when you start talking about design, or not even just design, just making things, and the whole question of what is the actual nature of making things? Does it always come down to there's a new object sitting in front of you? And we know just from Black American expressivity, so often it's not, you know, because we didn't invent drum machines, but we obviously created them. You know, saxophone, alto sax, you know, Austrian, 18 whatever. I mean, he invented the saxophone, but we clearly created the saxophone. So.
Exactly, which is the through line, you know, as we're having this conversation in 2020, right? And like a lot of our sidebar conversations within our different Black communities of creating, you know, these notions have been something that we've discussed, something that we've embraced, and we've all built our practice on. What I find interesting with the year 2020, now ears and eyes can tap into this conversation and exactly start to feel that expression. Like we're on a Nike chat right now. We're talking about basketball. We're talking about sport. Everyone got that primer of watching The Last Dance. You know, seeing Michael Jordan sort of become this like larger than life figure. And you see how he took a game of chance, which is just putting a ball in a hoop. And he basically broke that whole concept like open, you know, to one of these like seminal moments of this book. It's like this book that Mahfuz and I are working on called Black Canon.
I love it.
You know, we
or Canon Black.
exactly. You know, like the cover page layout is like very much like this is just one random spread, like the Migos versus the Three Amigos. Like wherever you go, Belly cover versus Casablanca.
Yeah.
But like what's funny is we made, as like a sort of studio Bible, like never to come out, as you
exactly. Return of documents. Yeah.
Just to have this like prism to be like, all right, then 2020 came thick and fast. Do you work in the same way? Obviously.
I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, the thing is, in some ways, I mean, to the degree, that I have a career, as opposed to a creative practice, which I'm not even sure is the same thing as an artistic practice, but just as a creative practice. In some ways, one could argue that basically what happened is that my mood board started leaking out, I mean, essentially things where I would just be like your book, I would just be juxtaposing things because they were just very telling, or they did something, or like I just say, some of them just come down to they created energy of different sorts: aesthetic energy, cognitive energy, conceptual energy, philosophical, energy. I mean, one of my most I don't know what to say. It's like I could say one of my best works, or my greatest works, or my most popular works. And my metric of that is just how many times things get reproduced on Instagram. It really has nothing to do with like what the quote unquote critics think or whatever it might be. That it's like, is this piece I did called Mickey Mouse was a Scorpio, which a lot of people maybe would have seen, which is just juxtaposing Damballa, this cat from Haiti, with this face, and then Mickey Mouse, and you can see that it's the same entity, So like for me, that kind of drawing things together, or line or connection between things is a kind of creative, because I think when you see that, maybe I can pull it up. It's like, you can't really argue with that. You can't argue with like that this is the same entity.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's just really apparent and so much of, I think, in a way, African peoples find themselves in the Americas is a kind of dispersion, a kind of rupture. And so much of our creativity has to do with like repairing that rupture or making connections between things. You take this disparate thing, you put it next to that thing, and it becomes a new thing. It's like over and over again, that's the source of all our different modes of creativity, whether it be hip hop or bebop, or, Charlie Parker taking some Tin Pan Alley tune and like flipping it, basically.
Yeah.
So I was doing like harmonically flipping it, so much of our stuff is in that space. It's something like I like to say about Duchamp sometimes. It's like, he may not be the best artist of the 20th century, but he's definitely the most interesting, fine artist, So like the thing becomes is like, well, what's on the other side of that? If you actually made something without putting your hands on it, so to speak, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's essentially a post-quantum sort of formulation of making even. So what does that mean, and what are the implications of that, like going forward? So.
Yeah, and like, when you're saying that, all I can hear like Dilla flipping a sample and making like a whole new time signature. We've also talked about phase 2, our both of our graffiti.
Yeah, totally.
Like, New York, like the idea that these kids were just like, okay, let's advance this. Do you subscribe to the philosophy, like a little bit about this Black Canon book, like how much in Mahfuz too? You're a part of this three-way conversation.
No, go.
I want to hear your thoughts. Mahfuz, like, do you like this notion that the like Black expression and this idea that it's different from sort of like European canon expression of like inventiveness versus like voila, you're a genius type, notion. Do you see? How would you describe, like, is the Black canon sort of missing, or do you like, does it have to explain itself, this method of make?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. One of the departure points, I think, for the book was that there are these things that all of us as Black people we know to be sort of like these like excessive sort of moments of genius, right? That can't even be metabolized by like what we would think of as like a white canon, like a like a museum, for instance, right? Like, I don't necessarily think that like, what like Surya Bonali or like Simone Biles or what Bo Jackson or or Michael Jordan, these kind of like sort of like surplus moments. I don't know that there traditionally have been systems in place to sort of like metabolize that kind of genius outside sport, for instance. I'm just using sport as an example. So when we were going through the book, we were like, what are things that are just even funny, even in a sort of just everyday way, like Stevie Wonder's version of like Happy Birthday versus like the traditional Happy Birthday song, right? Where like, I don't even know if I've sung the traditional Happy Birthday song in like 20 years. And we started like putting that sort of into the book. And then also looking at places where we couldn't find a parallel. Like Deion Sanders is just alone on a page because we were just like, we don't know what to do with him. There's like nothing we can.
Yeah. What is the inverse? Yeah. What is the anti Deion Sanders? I don't know, but I think we probably don't want it to exist anyway.
That's with us publishing our own book, right? It's like the recording system is one thing. And I would say, when I see your work, Arthur, and when I create as well, it's this like unapologetic, like we're gonna write this down in a sort of concrete form, no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like you said, it becomes an artifact, like just as time goes on. And if Instagram or the community decides to like it a bunch or repost it, then it's like valid for that degree. But this unapologetic Black expression, like drawing all over the page in different mediums, is a part of the freedom.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's funny. I think I've said this before as well, but it's like, of all the things I think, because there's so much like in the same way, not that I judge my friendships in this way, but I would say a metric, one of my metrics, personal metrics of friendship, it's like people said things that sort of stuck with me. You know what I mean? That were provocative, that made me think. And I always think of like something you said very offhandedly, and I've said this before, which is that we were talking about, fashion and people making things. I think we were talking about Ralph Simmons or whatever, and you were saying like, well, one of the things about this different about how people sort of utilize or embrace fashion now is like in the past, you buy a cool thing by Ralph Simmons or whatever, whomever, and you wear it, you stunt with it, and then you come home and you put it in your closet. And you say, no, these kids, they acquire something, they wear it, they stunt it, they come home and they hang it on the wall and stare at it. You know what I mean? And I was just like,
yeah, that
was such a deep sort of observation that was sort of anecdotally, it was true. Like I was like, wow, yeah, that's really true. But it's such a fundamental shift of how we understand an object to function. I mean, one of the things that's a distinction between art artifacts and design artifacts or other kinds of artifacts is that, in a sense, in art, there's sort of inherent understanding that the thing is meant to be contemplated, is meant to be thought about in ways beyond just the immediate moment of how you utilize it, or even in the sense of how it functions. Like to a certain degree, one could argue that one of the things that Duchamp figured out with the urinal was that if you take a thing that has a specific functionality and you arrest or suspend that functionality, the thing becomes pure signified. You know what I mean? In other words, when you can't piss in the urinal and you put it in the art space or art gallery museum, which is really all structures of enforcing the whole idea that this thing, which was designed or conceived to be pissed into, but can no longer be pissed in, like they're gods who literally will prevent you from pissing in it, that something about the suspension of that functionality like creates a particular type of energy. And I don't even think it's just a suspension, the total suspension of that functionality. It's the like shifting of the functionality, or the sort of transformation of how we understand what that thing is supposed to be doing creates a certain kind of energy. And so much, like I say, going back to the DJ thing, it's like, if you put this tune next to that tune, you're creating a new interface, and that generates energy. So it's really about energy at the end of the day, I think. So.
Yeah, energy and signaling, like these words that, in 2020, obviously, like, gain a whole different sort of weight and gravity. I've been thinking about like you know, just like a lot of how I'm sort of categorizing like fashion moves these days, like as an extension of that sort of like thought process, is like they become objects in the fashion space to signal something, you know, and a lot about signaling like irony, or like, let me physically mood board myself to put you on to things that you didn't know could be in this combination. And then the combination like says like, I am me. And even talking about styling, in the Black expression in terms of styling, I found like this is like a new Renaissance year. I'm working on like this like gathering of Chicago images of like, you know, this idea the boyfriend girlfriend used to match clothes. Common had like a great line about, I think it was like when he was dating Erykah Badu, like, like, you know, like cracked open this idea, like not walking around watching matching or rocking matching shirts. But these idea of like the evolution and trajectory of like the new Black expression that's leading the charge in terms of the fashion space. But
I mean,
yeah.
one of the things I'm just thinking about, one of the things that I constantly am asking myself recently, because I'm like, I always tell people, this is a horse I rode in, and I'm really sort of obsessed, obviously, with Black aesthetics. But people sometimes assume, as if that's even possible, they assume that that's all you're interested in. Whereas to me, in a sense, being obsessed with the Black aesthetics inherently means you have to be obsessed with all aesthetics.
Yeah.
You know, going back to this material versus treatment, like I think so much of Black creativity does function, not all, but it does function, has functioned because of circumstances in the space of treatment as opposed to material. And if it's in the space of treatment, what that means is that one has to have the ability to assess the terms that's in front of you. Like if you can't dig up gold, right? You got to work with what's there. And that whole working on what's there means that you have to make a kind of sometimes intuitive, but sometimes quite formal analysis of what the given terms of whatever context that you're in is, whether it be fashion or sports or entertainment or just living. You know, you got to figure out how does this work? How does this function? And then how might this thing function better for me? How might it do more than what it was intended to do? You know, more than what it was determined to do, or more, you know, how might you operate outside of constraints that are placed on the thing to just do what it was intended to do? So, you know, and then a lot of that too is like always this tension between what I call specialists and uncommon folks. You know what I mean? Like there's always this tension with us, like between a person who studied a thing and people who just do things. You know, like one of my main points of reference all the time, I always go back to this, is this book called Juke Joint by Bernie Eames, which is basically just photos that he took of Black social spaces in Mississippi in the late 80s and early 90s. It's just such a phenomenal document. On one level, first of all, the things are just so amazing looking.
Yeah.
And they don't just look amazing, they look specific. There's something super specific about it. It's like, for one thing, just the fact that, you know, there's no sort of Black Academy de Francais that's sort of, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like overseeing and making sure that everybody's things are aligning. But nevertheless, you see in this book, and I'm sure there was never a Mississippi Design Conference that happened. You know, there was no Delta Design Conference, but nevertheless, you can see it's a real aesthetic. It's a very real aesthetic that's consistent across all these different people who were implementing it in these different spaces, you know, probably unaware of each other's actual things. So I'm like super interested in that whole tension between, like Ismail Reed called it, like you say, who wrote that? Who made that? He say, Jess Grew made that. Meaning, you know, it just sort of spontaneously sort of emerged from, you know, without an author, so to speak. There's no author attached to it. So much of the thing to me is like being a specialist and thinking about these things a certain kind of way, making things, but at the same time, always in a kind of very particular kind of relationship to things that get made that aren't authored. You know what I mean? Things that you just find on the side of the road, or things that Black people do where they're not thinking about being artistic. They're just thinking about making the shit work with what the, you know, the terms that they find themselves in. So.
Yeah, but what you highlighted in the last two passages of what you said I was starting to think of this metaphor of like treatment. You know, you said it's the context and the treatment.
Yeah.
Because us as Black people, you know, we're inherently born like oppressed. You know, there's a pressure.
Down press. Yeah.
And so that combined with like the treatment of the ecosystem really creates like invention in quotes, right?
Right.
And it's so, and like to explain to like a broader audience, like why that message that you're saying in Mississippi is probably consistent with Houston, with Chicago, with the outskirts of Paris, with Ghana itself, is like that oppression that is like easily sort of cast off as maybe not there or siloed here and doesn't exist there is so even that it creates this whole community and quotient that is opulent and expressive.
Right.
And
Yeah.
you know, like we invent out of like a 5-gallon drum can become a drum just as much as the DJ reference, just as much as, you know, and it's like the invisible is visible through our like excellence in expression with anything.
Yeah. But, you know, but the thing, again, you know, the question for me, like fundamentally is like, why would anybody else be interested in this stuff besides Black people? I mean, outside of the fact that it's undeniably magical, but like, what's the inherent interest in this stuff? And where is the point in which specifically Black modes of creativity dovetail with the human, so to speak, with larger humankind modes of expressivity and these kind of things? How do those things, where do they intersect? Because, you know, one of the things like I ask myself a lot, you know, because I oftentimes will go back to the music, because music is, it's not just the one space where Black expressivity and Black creativity is undeniable, and not just undeniable, but diverse and deep. And
yeah,
it's just not one thing. Even though we can say Black music, that's a million different things, you know, to say the least. But, you know, but inside of that space of this kind of diversity, like, what is it about what we do that everybody finds fascinating? Yeah. I mean, just fascinating, if on no other level. I mean, Klansmen will be walking around with dookie chains and stuff, like, you know, in the future. It's just, that's just how we do it. So the question to me, again, is like, why is this interesting to anybody else? Like, one of the things I think just on the music is like, we know that there's something about the circumstances that we functioned inside of that I think, you know, I like to say sometimes like we're the canary in the mine shaft. Like we're kind of, we live in the future in a certain way. And it's a horrible dystopian future that we've been living in for like, you know, 4 or 5. As somebody said to me, I was in Australia, somebody had this great thing. They said, it's like, when it happens to white people, it's a dystopia, but when it happens to us, it's just life. You know what I mean? And so, but I think there's something in our artifacts, the things that we make, I think people inherently sense that these are things from a future that everybody is like very quickly propelling towards, you know? So like migrant crisis, these are things that Black people have lived inside of for literally hundreds of years, you know? And so it's not just that like in going to see a horror film, you're going to see something that's frightening to you that you fear may happen to you, but it's also the fact that despite us being in the mine shaft, deeper in the mine shaft than anybody else, like we continue to, you know, we continue to live, we continue to thrive, not just live, we don't just survive, we literally thrive. And I think everybody takes that, even the people who are basically trying to stamp it out, they take a certain solace in the fact that we refuse to be stamped out and that we move forward and we continue not just to move forward, but we increasingly are able to think about publicly, to have precise and insightful exchanges about what we're doing. We're not just doing these things. We're actually getting to the point where we're, you know, not that it's a new thing, but increasingly social media, all this thing make it possible for these ideas to disseminate in a completely different kind of way. So, you know, so I think this is a really interesting, you know, moment to be investigating these things. So. Yeah,
and Mahfuz, I'm gonna let you jump in, but frame this. I'm gonna toss you a premise and craft it back into a question for us as a freestyle. And we're literally doing what we do. We were supposed to do a talk that was scripted, and instead,
I didn't realize.
and instead, But this notion that like this specific like civil rights movement and like both of our practices, like whatever you want to put them, like the moment where your work like sits in a space, whether it's like I have friends texting me that are looking at like a photo work at some art fair that's like Arthur killed it again, you know, and then like some kid gets the collage of images and there's like one image that's like a deep cut reference that, you know, strikes pop culture in a specific way, or whether it's like I make like a, you know, like a Jordan with holes in it or something, and it goes around and it's kind of becomes like its own thing. Like, Mahfuz, can you break, like, what's your thought process like on zooming out and like this civil rights movement now in context of having these artists like tackle that within their own work at that front? Is there anything that sort of strikes you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to come at it from an oblique, because I might not totally answer that question. But what I'll say is I'll say that I think a lot about points of capture, wherein like a lot of what Black artists make, a lot of what we make is fundamentally discursive or contextual, and has been so for very long periods of time. You know, riffing on the comment about Duchamp, right? Like the real sort of swerve that he introduced was this idea that like an artwork is like fundamentally contextual, right? It's about the sort of system of like discourses and conversations that it marshals around it, you know. And you always find like people, particularly in the particularly that are critical of the art world, that are just like, what is that, you know? And you're like, it's not you know, it's not a chair, right? Like there's not that kind of discourse around it. It's a different kind of discourse, and it does lots of different things. And so I'd say with like Black art, I think there's been a degree to which, you know, if you look at conceptual art and the emergence of conceptual art, Black artists took to it very, very quickly, like easily, like there wasn't even like a lapse, you know, like in the 70s, I feel like where Black artists were able to very quickly be like, oh, it's about this is what we already do. This is already our métier, you know, manipulating and playing with language. And so I think of that in a similar way now in this quote unquote moment, or for the last 4 or 5 years, you know. I think like I'll use like AJ as an example. Like I was aware of what AJ was doing long before like Made in LA in 2016. And I think so, and I think my like friends were, and I think people that I was in conversation were, but the rules, like the discursive rules of the game changed, and suddenly it became apparent that a lot of that work had always been about sort of like the contemporary, or like had always been about what was going on. And I would say something similar with you, V, where like if you look at things like DJing, for instance, where DJing was always a part of like the discourse, it was always a part of the conversation for you. And at a certain moment, people started like connecting like dots, you know. I'm like running long now, but I'll say that like I remember in Milan a couple years ago, we did a talk, and Maurizio Cattelan was in the front row, and I thought like one of the ironies of it was that he has positioned DJing as being sort of central to like what he does, right? He's like, oh man, it's like relational aesthetics. I'm into DJing. It's mixing, it's remixing. You know, you have like the whole like Nicolas Bourriot thing, but none of them actually DJ at all. Right? None of the people that are talking about relational aesthetics or the DJ as metaphor have ever actually DJ'd. But in that moment, for some reason, he saw like a creative kinship between the two of you, and you were metabolized into a tradition that maybe you came at from an oblique. And now it's totally natural for him, like a year ago in Flash Art, to be like, I want to talk to Virgil. Like we do the same thing, right? And that's kind of how the art world works. And so I think that's what happened to a lot of Black artists. Shit that like we were already doing, always already doing, just hits a point of capture. And at that moment, there's this like detonation.
And that's
yeah, I love that answer.
No, but that's where like all of us in our sport metaphors, you know, come to play. You know, Arthur had the great, you know, I think you contextualize it in the term figure skating, which, you know, has sparked us for sure, but this idea of sport, right? So you take a kid in the hood of Chicago who's like, basketball or selling drugs is my only way out. And, you know, you birth this whole new style of playing the game, a whole new sub competition of, you know, high school players, you know, like, and then you create this relationship with guys that have made it to the league and guys that are still in the hood. And then the sport is like doubling on itself. And I think the same about skateboarding in Black. You know, like it was a sport that was not for Black kids, you know, initially. And it was like, you know, it had its own aesthetic and its own ecosystem. There was a style of skating. It was very much what it was. And then all of a sudden you fast forward to today, like if your clip doesn't have a Playboi Carti song on it, it's missing, you know, 7 layers of energy. And if it doesn't have like a fashion sneaker that you're not supposed to wear with it, it doesn't have the right pant. And it's like the style of the trick is a whole nother thing. Like this whole thing of we all transverse different, different boxes, basically, you know, whether it's art or whether it's just creativity, or whether it's fashion or whether it's just ready-made, organic, just being in the hood. Like we have a bird's eye view, I feel like. But Arthur, what's your thoughts on like?
Well, go ahead. So ask the question.
No, there was not even really a question. I'm just opening the door of like that.
I mean, look, you guys said so much. Like I was taking notes, right? Like the whole idea that like we took to conceptual art. Like, look, Black life is conceptual art, and I know that sounds, you know, like an obvious thing to say, but it really is true. I mean, Black being is essentially conceptual in the sense that if you take people and you create a structure that's telling them intergenerationally that they're not even human beings, like, and all the things that inform any human being's sense of themselves, like community, family, neighborhood, land, nationhood, all these kinds of things, right, are removed or stripped away. And you're in a context where people are bombarding you constantly with this idea that you're subhuman, less than human. And nevertheless, we insist on our humanity. That insistence is conceptual. It's fundamentally conceptual, particularly in the context when it's not even yet physically manifested in legal structures. They hadn't transformed legal structures. It's conceptual. So the whole idea of the tension between what the world is and how you understand or assert the world is, that's an essentially conceptual relationship. You just can't get around that. And if you combine that with the fact that, like, as someone said, Black culture is a culture in a perpetual state of emergency. Like improvisation is creativity in a state of emergency, right? But I always take that emergency not to just be a perpetual state of crisis or trauma, but also a perpetual state of bringing things into being, which takes emergence, which takes us back to the conceptual part. You know what I mean? So all of this stuff is like, I don't think it's an accident that you're starting to see the proliferation of certain kinds of ideas, certain types of practices. Like again, I always joke with people, like, I was like, well, my art career is about 4 or 5 years old at this point, like literally. Like for my first show in a gallery I ever had, which was Gavin Brown. I mean, I was in a group show, a couple of group shows like 10, 20 years earlier, like in 2000. But, you know, it was like 15 to 16 years before I ever had a solo show, a show where I went in and was just me. I'd never done that before, you know, and I had long since even forgotten about being an artist, but I never stopped being a creative. I never stopped being a person for whom creativity was at the forefront of what I was doing. I just couldn't, you know, I couldn't figure out how to make a living from it. You know what I mean? So to speak. Even times people ask me, oh, you seem to have like, you know, chosen the art world over the film world. And I just laugh and I say, no, the art world chose me. You know what I mean? I mean, it literally did. And so my relationship to it is a relationship of a certain kind of privilege. It's a relationship of a certain kind of, I realize I'm lucky or I'm blessed, let's say, but I also to understand it's a context and a relationship where I don't actually, you know, when people were asking me about, oh, what it's like to win the Golden Lion, I was like, good. And then all my friends kept saying, no, it's a big deal. My artist friends, they were saying it's a big deal. And I was like, yeah, I know it's a big deal. Everybody keeps telling me it's a big deal. And I wasn't trying to be like, oh, I'm not fazed by anything. I was just, at a certain point, I was just like, you got to understand, I did not grow up knowing that the Golden Line for art exists. I didn't know it existed, right?
Yeah.
And I think also the things that exist for you as sort of kind of markers of getting a certain place in your life, like getting a Grammy Award or getting an Academy Award or something like that. In the art world, because I didn't understand myself as that. So I don't have any built-in wiring to appreciate the Golden Line. Like even when I got it, like the funniest thing I did, I don't think anybody sort of got it. Like when they were taking the pictures, like, oh, I can stand here. And I did the Heisman Trophy.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, I don't know how many people got that, but a lot of it was really just about, well, when I think in my mind about external markers of having achieved something, so to speak, it's like the Heisman Trophy is the first thing I could think of. You know, the Oscar, the Academy Award is maybe the second thing, but I just don't have that around the Golden Lion. So as much as I appreciate getting it, you know, it means my relationship to the whole apparatus is very contingent. Like I'm very much a conceptualist. I'm very much interested in making things that resonate in various contexts in different kinds of ways, but I don't know if I completely subscribe to so many of the ideas of quote unquote art. You know what I mean? It's just a space I'm operating in at this moment. So
no, it's very much the same for me in fashion. You know, the number one archetype I've used from the beginning is this Trojan horse. You know, because, you know, I'm still from Chicago and, you know, just the two words Louis belt literally means like an Oscar.
mm-hmm.
You know, this is a place where people will kill somebody for a Louis belt. And then I'm in a place through means of, you know, making things to be at a place to make a real Louis belt. Like almost like is like proof of an internal concept, but the external concept is like just really to throw a monkey wrench in the process of making. You know, this line that we're talking on is like Nike, right? And I'm taking ownership of like obviously the privilege we have, but this idea that now that there's Black people in a creative position to start sticking plugs in different sockets, right? And like you said, it's conceptual art from birth, you know? So bringing that and using this sort of hardwire of fashion, which has this like innate, easy to understand, it's close to the body, brands are something that we've always aspired to be. You know, I focused on my practice as building this layer that almost sits above these brand name things and they're under control of me. In everything from a Louis Vuitton to a Nike to Mercedes-Benz to Evian to XYZ. And then now building this conceptual practice of like veering in and out with like mass-produced products, but mean something. Like here, just vibes that I don't know, maybe I shouldn't show these.
Yeah.
Show these. Like a new vibe that I'm working on, which is just like a Ghana Air Force One. But like contextualizing it like next to this, you know, like what does Black culture look like when we have the sort of like megaphone from that branded context and we start creating things that signal back to ourselves.
Right. I mean, you know, it's funny. I'm listening to you and I'm thinking like something. I'm going to try to say it. It's probably not going to come out so clear, but one of the fundamental things that I think matters is this whole notion, and I think it's what comes up again and again when I say treatment versus material. This fundamental notion of things not being limited to what they were intended to be. Like, you know what I mean? The fact that you can take one thing and use it in a way that the person who invented it never used it. It's like, that is a fundamentally emancipatory gesture, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. They say you're not human, you assert you're human. They say you're a sneaker, but you realize that's a scepter or that's a crown. You know what I mean? How these things have value, that we are asserting this value in the things above and beyond what they were conceived to be. And that thing of operating outside of preconceptions, imposed conceptions, is what's mostly emancipatory about it. If it's Charlie Parker, he takes a tune, he improvises on it, right? It's not to say that the original tune wasn't creative. It's just the whole idea that unlike a classical orchestra, where you have a composer, the white guy who's sitting here, you have the composition, and then you have a conductor who essentially is an overseer, that baton might as well be a whip, right? You know? And it's whipping and keeping everybody in line, right? So that they play the composition as it was conceived by the master or the composer. Versus Charlie Parker and Bird and Dizzy and all those cats, where they take a tune. It's not to say they're trying to erase the tune, but they take the tune and they take the tune as a point of departure, not as a point of being contained or constrained. So I think, to me, in one big overarching conceptual thing, it's about the kind of art of making things which don't presume or don't rest inside of the preconception of what they were supposed to be, that have the ability to continually evolve based on context, usage, what people do with it. So.
Yeah, it's like on my desktop right now, I have this image of Bo Jackson. Like, I prepared some images. Maybe we should go through some just random stuff. Yeah. Like, let's see, share screen.
Well, see, I even pulled mine aside because when they said the share screen thing might just be disruptive, I just grabbed some things.
You got
randomly. Yeah, I'm gonna show what since.
Bingo. Albert Ayler.
Yeah. But with this, yeah, he's a bad motherfucker. I named my son after him. But the point is, it's like if you saw this cover in person, it's what I would call bad printing. Like, I love the printing, like Jamaican album covers. I've been collecting album covers for years. Like, again, Gregory Isaacs is a bad motherfucker. It was like most stylish cat. The way his hand is down here on his hip, you know, it's on some kabuki shit, right? The way he's standing. But if you saw the printing is bad printing. So what does it mean when, quote unquote, bad printing becomes something that you have positive associations with? You know what I mean? Like, I'll give you a couple, I pull one or two more quick things. Okay. James Van Der Zee, a black escape artist.
Wow.
In chains. Now, Houdini was a bad cat, but I'm sorry. He wasn't as bad as a black cat who chained himself.
And escaped.
It escapes. That's I mean,
conceptual art.
It should have been like some like Jack Johnson kind of shit. You know, black man who made a living knocking out white men at a period when white men would lynch black men for looking at them the wrong way. How is that even possible? That doesn't really make sense. Like, if you made Jack Johnson up, the shit wouldn't make no sense. It would be like kind of, oh, that's not possible. How could that be possible?
Feel like a Disney movie or something. What's that?
That's Flash Gordon.
Oh my God.
Right? On top of like being the merciless. I always wanted to do a novel called Ming, which was going to be about Ming the Merciful. It was going to be about everything we know about Ming and Flash Gordon was like some propaganda. And the reality is like Ming was an Afro-Asian, like, you know what I mean, revolutionary who resisted on Planet Mongo's the intrusion of these blonde motherfuckers, right?
Yeah.
I got one or two more. Just grab them randomly. Like Angela Davis on the cover of Life. And we know on the cover of Life, it just does something else that just a picture Angela Davis doesn't do. It's resonating in a specific kind of way. And finally, but not one of my favorite album covers of all time.
Yeah. It's my favorite.
David Bowie, From the Man Who Fell to Earth. And essentially the soundtrack that he envisioned for The Man Who Fell to Earth, which they didn't use. You know what I mean? Like, this was his idea, the second half of the record, his idea of what it should have sounded like. Would have definitely been a better movie. And last but not least, Rossman Vibration.
Yeah.
You know, one of the best album covers. This is the one where you can actually feel the texture on the burlap back there. And Neville Garrett, one of the greatest black designers of all time, who was Bob Marley's best friend. You know, I remember like listening to this record, like when I was 16, and it was like the music wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Like when I first heard it, I actually laughed at it. I was at a radio station called WROX in Clarksville, Mississippi. And all my friends were about 3-4 years older than me, and I was interning at this radio station. And this record came in as a promotional, right? And I walked in, and they were sitting around, 4 cats, listening to it and laughing at it. Because to them, to their ears, it sounded like it was the same song over and over, and they just changed the lyrics, which basically sounds like hip hop almost on a certain level. but it just like, they were cracking up. It's the same song, the same rhythm over and over, and he's got a funny accent. And I laughed at him too, because I wasn't confident enough at that point in my life to assert a different feeling, but I very quietly stole the record and took it home. Nobody missed it because it was a joke to them, but I stole it and took it home because I knew there was something there. And it could be just reduced to the music, which was incredible, but it's the whole package, how all these things just had a vibe that I couldn't quite, it was like alien to me, but attractive. Sometimes I call this the alien familiar. When you come in contact with something that's a manifestation of your culture, but in a different register than you used to sing it. Like when I see David Ajay's work, I think about that, right? You know, it's all the black shit, but it's mapped onto a context where there's not a ton of examples in the conventional structural architectural sense, where you see what those things look like in that new context, you know, in that new modality, in that new medium. And so this was really dope to me. It was like, I didn't know what Rastafarian was. I didn't know what Nibingi was. I didn't know what reggae was. I didn't completely understand this design aesthetic like in 76, but it was a really profound shift in my like ability to appreciate. It was really an assertion of values that were counter to some of the given or tall values that I had. So.
Yeah, you know, like I'm thinking like Angela Davis on Life, like the biggest bar of this whole talk, like, you know, like the head explosion emoji obviously is this like, you know, like conceptual art emanating from the Black global experience, you know. And I think of, you know, Andre 3000 shirt, you know, that he just put it into words like, you know, obviously the darkest people suffer the most globally. And it's like, we've become like, you know, like bringing my like sculptures that I'm making, like for a show that I'm going to do in Ghana, me and my mom are making these sculptures that I grew up with. And so she's production manager of me like tapping back into these artifacts that I just grew up around. And I was always like, you know, the African kid who, you know, parents ate different, talked, you know, English isn't their first language. And this idea that these artifacts that we grew up with were like them coming to America, but bringing a piece of like their recognizable home and being like, this is who we are inside of our experience. And this ties back to that narrative, but like just being Black.
Yes.
Is by nature in this system that we're in, like, you know, robbed of humanity and robbed of like basic human rights and like freedom. And then you have fast forward to us who are like discovering these things through these like hollowed spaces.
Yeah. You know, some of my greatest experiences, like the things that stick with me, like they're not great because somebody told me they were great. They're great because they stick with me. Like I grew up until I was about 12 years old, maybe 13 or 14, maybe even. We lived in a trailer. Now I know it sounds, you know, because trailers now are associated with, you know what I mean, the underclass or whatnot. But in the 70s, trailers were like space capsules. They were like some futuristic Apollo kind of thing. They were these prefab aluminum things that had all this paneling in them, and everything fit like in a spaceship, you know, sliding doors, all this kind of stuff. So we moved into a trailer, right? We purchased a trailer and then they rolled it up to the plot of land, right? And I remember certain things in it, like in the living room of the trailer, because it was all prefab. It came with a piece of art glued to the wall. And it was like a flamenco.
Moved in, or like when you
Yeah, when you moved in, like it wasn't like now maybe you could choose the art. Then it was like it had a slightly Spanish theme, and it had this white woman like with a mandolin or something. I guess she was a flamenco player on the wall. And I can remember at 8 or 9 years old, my dad taking the thing down off the wall and painting her black. Mm-hmm. And he didn't make any big pronouncements about it. He just kind of did it. But I've never forgot that, right? In the same way, I can remember one day my mom was pressure cooker. You know what they look? Yeah. That's on the top. She was cooking collard greens, right? And I guess she didn't put the lid on right or something. So at a certain point, it exploded. Like in the living room, the kitchen was right out there. And it was like a bomb going off inside of our trailer, right? And there was collard greens splattered all over everything. Like literally years later, I would be on the floor picking off a piece of dried collard green. But the first time I think I was exposed to Jackson Pollock, my mind immediately went right back to these exploding collard greens in the living room. There's something fundamentally similar about it. I mean, I was like, so to me, it's like when you start to have these kinds of associations, that's like something exists. And then people try to teach you to think about it in a certain kind of way. You know, if you see Picasso, you're supposed to think about Matisse, and you're supposed to think about Braque, and you're supposed to think about in relation. They're not just teaching the thing. Teaching the thing means teaching the thing in relation. But when you start to have all these different relationships to the thing, and you start to bring those things, they start to have bearing on the things that you make. That it seems to me fundamentally is what we're talking about.
These are my show notes. As we ramp out, we're going to do questions and stuff, because this is about to go into hour 3. But as you touch on that, like a lot of my focus with the practice, like the bird's eye view, especially in 2020, has been like to unprogram that exact program you're talking about, which is like, okay, if you follow the sort of European canon, the white canon, it's like, when you see this, you're supposed to go down this road. Like, don't look the other way.
Yeah.
Like, you're supposed to go from Picasso to Matisse and down this pre-prescribed lane that fortifies everything that we want to see of the world. In my show notes, that was the exact conundrum, that we were talking about yesterday. This idea, like I put in this like illustration of Picasso's journey, but going backwards to African art, which
you got to send me that. I haven't seen that.
I'll put this in the box, but my creativity like blasts out, and certain members of the European canon can easily just lash out and be like, that's mine. Like, obviously you took that from this and you took that from that, but we won't open up the colonial can of worms. But the essence of, okay, if you see Picasso, you're supposed to see XYZ, or if you see holes in a garment, you're supposed to see Prada Raf Simons, but ignore that I did that 1 year before in the same sort of recorded canon. Mm-hmm. Just shows that this Black expression, like our expression, is on a different time scale. It comes from different air, and it comes from different generational like pressure. Mm-hmm. That you can't do. What I love is we're rounding out. It's like you can do side-by-side comparisons to illustrate some points, but then there's a whole segment of that critical theory that deserves a whole new set of comparisons to help them understand
absolutely
quintessential point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry. Bars after bars after bars. Thank you. I think you're right. We need to get into hour 3, but I did promise, and we said this yesterday, that we would have to cut off just as we're warming up. But I just want to take a couple of questions from everybody on the chat. One here that Arthur, you just touched on a little bit. What from Better Than You? What is the role that Black women play in art?
I mean, I don't want to take our silence to. I just don't think, me personally, I just don't think you can do anything, as a friend put it last night, with like certain levels of gender imbalance. I think it just, I mean, I could come at it from a kind of PC kind of way, but it's not even a PC thing. It's just about things having equilibrium and having like balance. I mean, it's like standing on one leg. Yeah, it's amazing to see a Maasai warrior stand on one leg, but standing on one leg is not the way forward. You have to have your feet like firmly planted. And that's really, I think, only possible when we don't have, like, as much as I can go on and on about Black aesthetics, particularly in the 20th century, we know that jazz, as amazing as it is, it betrays certain, it has certain internal faults just because women in jazz were situated in a certain kind of way. It's not like, you can't think about the history of jazz without thinking about all the amazing like female vocalists, say, for example. And the Black voice is so central in terms of like jazz expressivity, but nevertheless, it still is like, it's like in a way, it's almost like women on a pedestal of certain sorts. It's like, you got the Billie Holidays, the Sarah Vaughan, you can just go on and on and on. When you think about vocalists in jazz, you actually think about women. You don't actually think about guys. But there's something interesting going on that has to be unpacked around the whole question of Black women as instrumentalists or as composers. I can almost name on my hands like Amina Claudine Myers, organ player, piano player, Mary Lou Williams, but it's literally only a handful. And I remember hearing this story one time. There's a famous Charlie Parker song called Donna Lee. And I may be getting it wrong, but I think it's something like this. So he has this song called Donna Lee, but somebody told me once, have you ever heard the story of Donna Lee? And I said, no. And they said the story was that Donna Lee was this bass player, the sister. She was supposed to be really bad. And of course, she wanted to function inside of the context of the baddest players like anybody else would. And apparently she asked somebody who was a mentor figure that what she needed to do. And they told her she should cut her fingers and put salt in her fingers. And that was going to toughen up her fingers. But she, in fact, destroyed her hands, right? Now, I don't know if that's a true story, but it speaks to something around a kind of horror, something super problematic around the sort of resistance to Black women as instrumentalists. Like, it's almost really like a psychoanalytical analysis of it has to happen to really begin to unpack this sort of presence of Black women, but in a very sort of isolated kind of way. So I don't know. But I don't want to recreate it in what I do. So I think I'm good on my side. So.
Well, actually, that's actually a good segue to the other question that we just had come in actually for you, Arthur. What are some of the pieces for you? What are some of the pieces of advice that you would give up and coming Black filmmakers?
I get asked this one a lot. Just keep making things. I mean, like, I don't know, like you can't, I think sometimes people want a formula for it, but even if I could sort of reduce my own, let's say, trajectory to a formula, it's not a formula that I would say anybody would want to replicate, I wish I had arrived at the space that I'm at now of being able to do what I want to do at least 20 years earlier. Like I'm in my late 50s. And so it's not, so my personal trajectory is not a model that I would say anybody should try to replicate, first of all. The main thing I think is just to keep working. I always say, move towards your bliss. Move towards your bliss. Privilege your bliss over anything else. Privilege the things that feel dope, that feel right, that feel energizing. And even though all of us have to make some kind of accommodations to the real world, paying our bills, pragmatic considerations, we all have to do that, but always make this space. Like I used to say to some people sometimes, I don't always have the best ideas, but I never forget a good idea. Like I just always squirrel it away. My books in a sense are just me squirreling away good ideas. And, and that has a certain value in and of itself, even if it's nothing but you think you're coming up with something new and you look, it's a sort of journal, you look back and say, yeah, I have enough distance to see what it is I'm preoccupied with. So just keep working, pursue your bliss. That's what I would suggest.
Appreciate that. Okay, one for you, Virgil, before we wrap up. What did you think of the rap, since you just mentioned it? What did you think of Rap for Prada in Spring 21?
Good question.
I know, big one.
Sorry, this is a closed room, right?
Safe space.
here's like a fundamental, like I'll hark back to this conversation as a whole. And I'll even touch on Arthur's answers. You know, it's all in here. It's, you know, I'm not free in creating in this industry until it's equal and balanced, right? So that's like, resonate on that for a second. You know, of course, people think that like, oh, you know, I've reached this place to be able to be in the fashion industry, to say, to be on the same sort of platform. But until there's Black designers that aren't the minority, will my work be even understood or even defended in that canon? Which is another pause. Like, you know, like my work will be completely misunderstood from the point of when I was known going forward, because it's attempting to fit into the canon of the book that exists, but they don't know that this book that's coming is to be written, which is like everything that we talked about in this call. It's the same as, you know, we're not a healthy ecosystem till it's balanced with women of color within it. So we're already trying to communicate something to half of an ecosystem. So when I'm asked about like practical things within fashion, you know, the one thing that I've done is like stopped sort of like facing this canon and to sort of like showcase the validity of my ideas and my point of view. It's more for me like facing my community and bringing more people up through it. That sort of categorizes like the value. You know, I'm not an argumentative, I'm not like a scorekeeping kind of person. So that whole idea of tick for tack doesn't work in a critique for me going forward. You know, I often reduce or think about fashion in this way. You know, there's this calendar that's got every brand name that you know on it. And like, we're trading positions like F1 racing, right? But in fashion, we're teaching everyone, we're leading this idea of design for the people. Mm-hmm. So there's 30 of us total, you know, so collectively we're all designing clothes for a whole population. And it's not this industry of showing on a Wednesday and then someone shows in Milan and then you sit back and you like look at scores. My approach has always been one of the kid with the Louis belt in Chicago. You know, the kid that is trying to get his first pair of Jordans on the bus and steals them from another kid. You know, like there's so much more nuance and there's so much more conceptual thinking to be brought to fashion than in access by Black people, basically. You know, that's what we're doing with public domain within Nike. You know, my career is pretty much like a crowbar in the most polite way. You know, it's like, let's get in and let's create and let's see what happens when Black people are able to create on the same level as our contemporaries within the European canon. So that's my long-winded answer.
Well, you've also just answered in a really beautiful way a lot of questions that have come in a couple different guises of basically saying, what would you tell your younger self? What advice would you give to young creatives in this space? What is the future for Black creativity? And I think that image of the crowbar you wrap that beautifully. So thank you so much, everyone. Does anybody else have anything we want to add before we drop off? Because as you know, we're at Nike and everybody's headed off to their other Zoom meetings right now. But I just
want to like add something.
Yeah. Let's close it out.
Yes.
I want to sort of say something that like Virgil can't. Like I think that like a whole sort of generation of Central European designers, from Helmut Lang to Martin Margiela to Ralph Simmons to Anna Muehlmeister, have like benefited from a sort of binary transposition in which they take a certain style or geist that like we know almost automatically to be Black and combine it with a certain type of model or a certain type of figure that cuts against that runs against that grain. And that was like certainly a big thing for like Ralph. Ralph definitely actively referenced streetwear, referenced black culture that had filtered through white, Dutch, Belgian, German youth culture. They were like looking at Nike ads, were buying turbulences, they were going to raves and parties. And in a lot of ways, I think in the 2000s, the menswear brand started to lag. And the thing that really picked it back up was Black kids in downtown New York, in Paris, in London, starting to sort of fetishize like rare rough. And like he accepted all of that. I mean, we can sort of name all the Black kids that did it. So I think at a certain moment, I was even one of them. I mean, I think at a certain moment, it's happened time and time again where like we give and give, and then, you know, the hand that feeds him, he bites the hand that feeds him. So that's what I'll say about that. Like,
before everyone gets off,
this is culture a long time, you know?
Yeah, before these things get off, like when you say, like one of the funny things, I'll just jump in on that, is this is a valuable point, because this is the point of this lecture series in itself, you know, to sort of have gallery nights, hear the Black perspective on things that you normally wouldn't hear in a meeting. And, you know, you just think about techno, right? You know, when you said that, I think about techno. I think that there's this European sort of fetish that like it's this music that came from computers, you know, it came from Germany or something like that. But then when you go to Chicago and Detroit and you see that, you know, this tempo and this rhythm and this whole ecosystem, and then you also come to society and you realize that those practitioners weren't glorified. You know, we don't own that music. We don't own the hip hop portion, but you see how it proliferates through advertising, design, subculture. You know, rap music was the greatest advertising for all brands on planet Earth. You know, Jay-Z inventing like a quadruple entendre about, you know, throwback jerseys to Audemars Piguet, you know, whatever. It's in the water, it's in the air. And then when it comes to designing the actual product, when it comes to marketing or adding color or creating the new versions, like those that are left from the table, it's a huge imbalance. And so, you know, already when I hear questions of people are reacting to like, oh, what's your thoughts about an industry that sort of like looks at your work sideways or something, you know, it comes, you can't even begin to answer without like pulling up the receipts of the reality, and then you go from there.
Wow, absolutely. Okay, I think we're ready to wrap.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm ready to do part 2 after hours with whiskey.